And we're back. And as I was just saying, Darwin not only came up with the theory of evolution through natural selection, he came up with a different mechanism for evolution called sexual selection, which he mostly laid out in his book, The Descent of Man, although he did talk about it a bit in The Origin of Species. And it goes a little like this. You get competition between members of one sex for breeding rights, for the opportunity to mate with a member of the other sex. Now, often, but as we will see, not always, that's competition between males for the right to mate with a female. An example that might be familiar would be, why do deer grow antlers? Well, male deer will compete with each other, running into each other and pushing with those antlers for breeding rights to a female deer. It's often males, but again, as we will see in a bit, it isn't always, and it's important to understand why it isn't always. The second aspect is selection of mates by members of one sex. Members of one sex choosing which mate they're going to mate with. And often, but again, emphatically not always, this amounts to female choice. Females picking out which male they're going to mate with. And again, this is reversed often enough that, well, we'll look at that in a bit at the cases when it's reversed. Both of these can act independently of natural selection or together with natural selection or in opposition to natural selection. A classic study of this came out of the 1970s when John Endler started looking at wild populations of the common guppy. Now, if you go look at guppies in pet stores today, there are quite a lot of fancy guppy varieties that have been produced by natural selection, where both may be very colorful. The males often have very large fins and sometimes very distinctive patterns and colors and fin shapes and so on. Wild guppies are a bit more drab. This is a male, and as you can see, he's got some spots of color. Females are pretty much silvery all over the body. Females are not especially colorful. They are larger. Incidentally, the female retains her eggs in the body until they hatch, and so she gives birth to live offspring. And females tend to prefer colorful males. The more color on a male, the more likely the female is to let him approach and swing around this rolled up fin tube that he's got called the gonapodium and shoot his sperm into her oviduct. What Endler did, looking at wild populations of his guppies in Trinidad, he found that in wild populations that had fewer predatory fish, the males tended to be more colorful. When he introduced predatory fish into his guppy populations, the males got less colorful. And Endler reasoned that this was because natural selection and sexual selection were pulling in opposite directions. The more colorful males were more attractive to females, and so would leave more offspring because females wanted to mate with them. But colorful males were also more likely to getting picked off by predators, especially, well, visual predators. So if there were lots of predators present, colorful males were at a disadvantage. Females still wanted to mate with colorful males, but colorful males were more likely to get eaten before they ever got a chance to mate. And in populations with lots of predators, the guppies became more drab over time. On the other hand, where there's no predators, colorful males leave more babies than non-colorful males do, and the population can just get more colorful over time. So sexual and natural selection can tug in opposite directions. A fellow by the name of William Bateman codified the rule that males compete for females, like these elk, bugling and fighting in the mating season, and females are choosy about which males they allow to mate with them. This was based on his studies of fruit fly behavior. Fruit flies actually have fairly complicated mating behaviors to them. The male has to lick the female and then kind of chase her around before they actually get to mate. And Bateman argued that this was very generally the case in nature, that males competed and females were choosy. Darwin had pretty much felt that males were always competitive and females always selected the males that were the most beautiful. So here he's talking about structures and instincts which must have been developed through sexual selection, such as the weapons of offense and the means of defense possessed by the males for fighting with and driving away their rivals, their courage and pugnacity, that's combativeness, their ornaments of many kinds, their organs for producing vocal or instrumental music, and their glands for emitting odors. Most of these latter structures serving only to allure or excite the female. So the males are always going to be the most colorful and give the most interesting songs and produce the most intoxicating smells, to attract the females, who will choose which male is the toughest or the prettiest or the stinkiest. Except there's a lot of exceptions. Bateman's rule really turns out to be not a rule. Looking at the exceptions explains why sexual selection acts the way it does. Here you've got a case of where Bateman's rule is reversed. On the right, you've got an Australian katydid. On the left, you've got a close relative of the Australian katydid, the Mormon cricket. The Mormon cricket, by the way, is not called that because it tends to ring your doorbell. The Mormon cricket is called that because, if you remember your US history, the Mormons got driven out of Illinois and Missouri. And the founder of the Mormon church, Joseph Smith, was killed. And the leader, Brigham Young, basically had enough of trying to coexist and organized the Mormons into a big caravan that crossed the Rockies and found a place to settle in the valley of the Great Salt Lake in what's now Utah. So the Mormons settled in Salt Lake Valley and built houses and started planting crops. And a big bunch of this insect, Anabra simplex, swarmed the Mormon settlements and started eating all of their crops. Brigham Young prayed, and a big flock of seagulls promptly showed up and ate all of the Mormon crickets. To be perfectly honest, this probably would have happened anyway, but this is why there's a monument to the seagulls right in the middle of Temple Square in the heart of Salt Lake City. The Church of Latter-day Saints considers this a miracle, and so there's a seagull monument, and the Mormon crickets were the insects that could have destroyed the Mormon settlements' crops. They go through these annual population explosions. I remember having to drive across Utah and Nevada once in early June, about this time of year, and the highways were practically paved with Mormon crickets everywhere. And of course, you couldn't drive without running over them. So the roads had this reddish brown film of squashed Mormon cricket all over them. I heard there's cases where they even can make the roads slippery if you're not careful about driving. You can wreck because of squashed Mormon crickets. That's how common they are. Well, how do they get so common? Male katydids and Mormon crickets, uh, they produce sperm, of course. Like a lot of organisms, from Mormon crickets to pseudoscorpions to certain salamanders, they package the sperm in a little protein packet called a spermatophore. And katydids and Mormon crickets attach to the spermatophore a big lump of protein called the spermatophylax. And in Mormon crickets, the spermatophylax may amount to 25% of a male's total body weight. So this is quite a lot of energy that it requires to make a spermatophore and a spermatophylax. And at mating, the male inserts his spermatophore into the female. His sperm go in and fertilize her eggs, and the female gets to eat the spermatophylax, which is rich in protein and very nutritious. And here, female katydids will compete with each other for access to the choicest males. And that's the reverse of what Darwin thought would be the usual pattern. The females are getting competitive, and the males can afford to be choosy. And that competition is strongest at times when food is scarce. So there you've got a female cricket with, I think that's the spermatophore on top and the spermatophylax on bottom, sticking out of her general aperture. And she will actually bend around and start eating the spermatophylax. So there's a reversal. Another great case of a reversal is pipefish. Pipefish and seahorses and a few others are in a family of fish called the Syngnathidae, where the jaws are fused and the mouths are like little tubes. So if you've ever seen a seahorse up close, the mouth just looks like a little straw, because seahorses will slurp up tiny crustaceans out of the water. And so do pipefish. Pipefish are like seahorses, except they're not bent into a horsey shape. And in pipefish and seahorses, males are the ones that get pregnant. When female pipefish mate, the female will lay her eggs in a specialized pouch on the male's belly. In some species, instead of a pouch, he just has a long strip of tissue, and the eggs will stick onto that strip. In others, the strip is completely enclosed and the eggs are laid into this pouch. So the male carries them around, and eventually the male gives birth. It turns out that in this species, the male pipefish are choosy about females, and females compete with each other for access to particularly nice-looking males. The common thread in these examples and others is that the reversal is correlated with the male investing a great deal in reproducing. In the case of the katydids and the Mormon crickets, the male has to produce this lump of mostly protein that's 25% of his own body weight. That's a lot of energy. In the case of the pipefish, the male is not only just carrying the eggs around, tissues in the pouch or on that strip that I mentioned actually secrete oxygen so that the eggs can develop properly. So the male's got to invest not just energy in carrying them around, but energy in secreting oxygen to keep the eggs developing. So in those species and in others that show this reversal of the rule, the male's investing a lot of energy. And the general rule is that whichever sex invests more energy in reproduction has fewer opportunities to reproduce. And again, that comes down to the trade-offs that I was talking about at the beginning of the day. the more energy you put into reproduction, the fewer times you can reproduce. You've only got so much, you've only got so many resources that you can put towards reproduction. And so the more you invest in any given reproductive attempt, the smaller the number of times you can do it. And selection tends to favor behavior patterns by the sex that invests more, that select only mates of high quality. If you've got a limited number of opportunities to reproduce, it is not to your advantage if you throw them away on utterly worthless mates, right? You want to make sure that you pick the best mate possible, the mate with the highest quality. And I'll go into more rigorous detail later as to exactly what kind of quality that would be. But the point is that whichever sex invests more energy has more to lose, and selection will favor that sex being picky. Whichever sex invests less energy in reproduction can increase its fitness by reproducing as often as possible. If you invest less energy, that means you've got more opportunities, and selection favors behavior patterns that allows you to make use of those opportunities. And that's a difference between the so-called long-term interest of the sexes, and it's called asymmetry of sex. One sex will often have behaviors that are favored by selection that are quite different from what's favored in the other sex. Hence the asymmetry of sex. The problem is that in the real world, instead of Bateman's rule or a reverse Bateman's rule, there are, as they say in Australia, no rules, just right. So many other factors can affect the evolution of sexual behavior that it's really hard to come up with any rules that don't have exceptions all over the place. And you can see this in the evolution of the Australian bloomin' onion. Actually, I'm kidding. It's not the bloomin' onion. It's the Australian redback spider, Latrodectus hasseltii. As you know, everything in Australia can kill you, including some of the sheep. The deadliest snakes and the deadliest sharks and the deadliest crocs and the deadliest jellyfish and the deadliest spiders are all found in Australia. And this is one of them. The redback is in the same genus as the black widows that we get here. You can see even she's got a little hourglass-like marking right there. Pity the male redback. Male redbacks are a lot smaller than females, and they don't live nearly as long. A female redback spider might live 2 years. A male will only live a couple of months. Bear in mind also, by the way, that Australia is the driest continent, and populations of many living things are limited by lack of water and lack of things like vegetation that goes with that. So redbacks are not found clumped together. They're separated from each other. Now, spiders don't have penises as such, but male spiders have specialized appendages called pedipalps. They look a little like legs. Male and female spiders have these and often use them as feelers. But the male will often have a special organ on the tip of one of his pedipalps that he can fill with a sperm droplet. And then he can introduce his pedipalp into the female's aperture and mate with her that way using this modified leg. The problem is that because of the geometry of the bodies involved, a male that wants to mate with a female has to fill his pedipalp with a sperm droplet, and to insert it at the correct angle, he has to do a somersault and land directly on the female's jaws. And as he copulates, the female eats him. This is known as sexual cannibalism or copulatory suicide. and it's pretty much universal. There's a few cases where the female might not eat the male, but she usually does. And he ends his life as he is mating for the only time in his life. Very operatic, very Tristan and Isolde. And it's counterintuitive, but males that are eaten have higher fitness. For one thing, males that get eaten, if the male is eaten, the female has less of a chance of mating with another male later. So if the male is eaten, the female will store his sperm and be less likely to accept another male. So he will fertilize a greater percentage of her eggs if he's eaten than if he's not. It boosts the female's nutrition, right? He is a healthy and nutritious meal for her. And that will mean if she's better nourished, she'll be able to lay more eggs and care for more eggs. When the male is being eaten, copulation actually goes on longer, so he can transfer more sperm if he just sits back and gets devoured as he's copulating. He will transfer more sperm than if he doesn't. And it turns out that in the few cases where a male does survive after mating, he never feeds, he never leaves the female's web, and eventually just dies. So think about this. In this species, let me go back. This species living in arid regions, regions that are kind of dry, they're scattered, and the males are very small. A male after mating might try to find another female, but he's pretty damn lucky to have found one female in the first place. If memory serves, I think only about 20% of males find a female at all. And his odds of finding a second female are quite low. So in this case, the reverse Bateman's rule doesn't apply. You would think that because the male invests less in reproduction, it would be to his advantage to mate multiple times. But because this is a sparsely distributed species, he's not going to get to mate multiple times. There aren't multiple times to be had. So in this instance, he stays by the female, and if he allows himself to be eaten, he will have more offspring than if he doesn't let himself be eaten. So this completely violates, the rules. But if that happens, then screw the rules. This is what works. This is what ensures the survival of Australian redback spiders. And that's an example of one of these exceptions that you keep finding. You're not going to get any sort of rule governing sexual reproductive behavior without finding lots of exceptions to it. Here's another fun example. In species where the female invests more, you would not expect mating with multiple mates to be favored. Because after all, the female, since she produces eggs, which by definition are larger and often more energy intensive to produce, she can produce fewer eggs than a male can produce sperm, which means that as far as getting the eggs fertilized goes, there's no advantage in having multiple males do it. The old joke, and this is a little fatuous, but they used to say it takes a woman 9 months to have a baby, no matter how many men you put on the job. And that's a little cringy, but it is in fact true. That because females by definition produce eggs, and eggs are larger and fewer than sperm, you wouldn't think there would be an advantage for a female to be promiscuous, not an evolutionary advantage. But in the pseudoscorpion, Cordylochermes scorpioides, not all male-female pairings succeed because there's some type of genetic incompatibility, where some males are just genetically unable to fertilize the eggs of some females. I'm not sure exactly what the system is. By the way, pseudoscorpions are very common There's lots of them in, any wild area. They're just about millimeter size and they tend to live in the leaf litter. So you've probably stepped on many uh, pseudoscorpions in your life, but you're not likely to see them unless you go looking hard for them. Anyway, there's a female with a bunch of eggs, and females in this species, if they mate with multiple males, they've got a better chance of producing offspring. Because if you mate with just one male and it turns out that he is genetically incompatible and can't fertilize eggs, that's all your work for nothing. So a female that mates with multiple males is likelier to leave offspring than a female that only mates with a single male. So in this species, females mating with multiple males actually works. It's what's favored. Another rule that you find, uh, competition within a sex, intrasexual competition, males competing with each other for access to females, or in some cases, it's the other way around. In a few species, this is a fight to the death. The problem with competition like that is that both competitors can be very badly harmed. If you're fighting with another male to the death for mating rights, then okay, you might win and kill your rival, but you may be so badly hurt that you die later or are otherwise out of commission and unable to mate. So if you're in many species, if you're a male and you fight to the death, it doesn't actually improve your odds of reproducing, because either you die or you win, but you may be too badly hurt to leave offspring. So selection very often has favored the evolution of non-lethal competition between males, sometimes called ritual combat. You saw that earlier when I showed that slide of elk fighting with their antlers. They can get hurt, but they're not killed that often by fighting that way. A lot of birds, males will compete with song and bright plumage. And I mean, they might kind of fly at each other, but males don't murder each other in the attempt to attract females. There's a really awesome book I should have made you all read by Gary Larson, the cartoonist. It's called There's a Hair in My Dirt. And there's a bit where there's this young girl, she's probably a teenager, but she's skipping along merrily through the forest, tra-la, 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 and she hears all of the birds with their beautiful song. But then when you see what the birds are singing, they're words like, "You and what army? You and what army? Hey, baby. Hey, baby. Hey, baby. Hey, you back off. Hey, you back off." The birds are singing this combination of pickup lines and threats, because what birds are actually doing is trying to attract females and trying to chase off rival males, and they're doing it with these song duels, these ritual displays. Here's a case where the competition is frequently lethal, and I mentioned this earlier when talking about genetic drift. In northern elephant seals, a successful male will claim a harem of as many as 20 odd females and will mate with all of them. The top 5 males in a colony may do 50% of the copulating, and fewer than a third of the males ever get to copulate at all. In this case, selection actually favors lethal combat because the males are huge and they slam into each other, and they've got this thickened skin on their necks, but it doesn't always protect them because they will smash into each other and stab at each other with their canine teeth. It's vicious fighting, and it is in fact frequently lethal. And the reason why that seems to be favored is because the rewards of winning are so high. Think about this. If you're a male and you fight, there's a chance that you'll lose and die, and there's a chance that you'll win, but be so badly hurt that you won't be able to take advantage. But if you win and you're not severely injured, you immediately gain reproductive access to 20 females that are perfectly willing to have your baby right then and there. So the risk is very high, but on average, the reward is greater. If you lose, you die. If you win, you can immediately set about the business of having dozens of babies. So in that species, where the average reward is greater than the average risk, even though the average risk is very high, selection does not select against lethal combat. Now here's a couple of male giraffes engaging in neck wrestling, and giraffes can certainly get injured. Neck wrestling and those little bony horns on top of a giraffe's head, they bash each other with those. And male giraffes can get hurt, but it's not lethal all of the time, and that's because male giraffes don't have this harem structure. Under those circumstances, a male that fights to the death, could die or could get too badly injured to continue. A male that fights and runs away will live to fight another day, because without that harem structure, the stakes are not nearly as high, right? A male that runs off still has a chance to come back and try again later. And that seems to be why you get neck wrestling in giraffes, or bugling and antler fights in elk and deer, or why you get, what's a good one? Male turkeys poofing out their feathers and strutting and waving their tails and all that. Or birds singing, hey baby, you in what army? You in what army? Yeah, that's non-lethal forms of competition between members of one sex for access to the other. I would have to look them up, but there are cases of females competing for access to males, sometimes so vigorously that the females end up getting hurt. So there's reverse gender cases of this as well. There's a more subtle form of male-male competition, and that's sperm competition. It is sometimes quite adaptive for a female to mate with several males. If females mate with several males, then selection favors the males that produce more sperm. Every sperm is like a ticket in the genetic lottery. If you have many people buying tickets, the more tickets you buy, the greater your odds of winning. So this is some data from a study about 20 years ago. This is the mean testis size relative to body size. On the left, that's just the primates. On the right, that's for all mammals. In species where females mate with only one male, the males have relatively small testes, and they don't produce much sperm. Well, I mean, they'll still produce millions of them, but they produce a relatively smaller amount of sperm. On the other hand, where females might mate with multiple males, the testes are considerably larger and the males produce more sperm. So gorillas, for example, are primates where an adult male has a harem of a few females and then some young and some adolescents that may later leave and set up their own troop. Gorillas have small testicles. Chimpanzees, they go through estrus, so for much of the year, the female is not interested in mating at all. But when a female chimp goes into heat, they've been observed copulating up to 80 times in a day. Obviously, this is with multiple males, because a single male that had to copulate 80 times a day would probably die. And chimps have much larger testicles relative to body size because each female is going to end up receiving sperm from several males. And the male with the greatest chance of fertilizing the female's eggs is the male that produces the largest amount of sperm. So selection favors big testes and lots of sperm in species where females mate with multiple males. These are members of the Cape ground squirrel species, Xerus inaris. They may go into estrus at any time of year, and when they are in heat, they may mate with 10 males in just a couple of hours. Males compete with each other by disrupting each other's copulations. You know, if a male and a female are copulating and another male walks in on them, he will try to push the other male off. And they also compete by sperm production because the males have among the largest testicles relative to body size of any mammal. I trust you don't need me to doodle this with the on-screen marker, but yeah, you can see that these males are packing rather a considerable scrotum in between their legs, all that. And that's correlated with the fact that they are a species in which females routinely copulate with multiple males. Yet another one, Apodemus sylvaticus, is the European wood mouse. Up there where it's A, that's a view of sperm cells. And you can see that the heads of these sperm cells have hooks on them. There's the head of a sperm cell, and then the flagellum sticks out that way down into the left. And Apodemus sylvaticus will mate with multiple males. Sperm cells from the same male chemically recognize each other, and sperm cells from the same male not only recognize each other, they will swim together and they will lock those hooks together to form sperm trains. So here, right there on the right-hand side of this picture, you've got a close-up of a sperm train. It's a whole bunch of sperm locked together, and in that train form, they can swim 30% faster than lone sperm could. So in this species, where females mate promiscuously, males have adapted in ways that give the greatest chance of reproducing successfully. They've evolved sperm that lock into sperm trains that can swim faster than lone sperm could. Sometimes cooperation among organisms or among sperm is the winning strategy. And we'll talk about biological altruism coming up later. Yet another indirect form of sexual selection may be males that engage in mate guarding. These are a couple of Nebraska tiger beetles where the male is just sitting on top of the female and physically blocking anybody else from mating. And these are some bugs I used to see a lot of at about this time of year when I was growing up in South Louisiana. This is Plessia nearctica. It's a fly in the family Bibionidae, also known as the love bug. When love bugs come emerging out of things like garden mulch and compost piles, they mate, and the male will stay coupled to the female for several days at a time, hence the name love bug. And you would see them flying surprisingly well. You'd think they wouldn't be able to fly properly, but you would see coupled love bugs with the male stuck into the female, both the male and the female flapping their wings and flying in tandem, you know, a little bit like a double rotor helicopter, flying better than you would think. That's another example of mate guarding, because as long as the male has his copulatory organ stuck in the female, nobody else can copulate with her. So that's male-male competition using the female's body as a kind of battleground. Oh, and love bugs would get so common they could, it made driving a lot of fun. You constantly had to sponge them off your car or they'd stick and ruin the finish. And they could clog your air intake if you didn't clean that on the regular. Anyway, males may also compete through the complexity of their penises. Um, Males can scrape out rival sperm. In the case of dragonflies and damselflies, males can scrape out rival sperm because they have these very hard, spoon-shaped, bristly penis attachments. Dragonflies and damselflies, when they mate, they form this thing called the wheel pattern, and the male will introduce sperm into the female's receptacle, and she can keep that sperm for quite some time. She can store it. She will tend to use the last sperm that went in to fertilize her eggs, and so she can exert choice by deciding. I'm putting deciding in quotation marks because the dragonfly isn't thinking these things through. But she may store one male sperm and then later find a higher quality male and mate with him. And he will use his little penis hoover attachment to scrape out the other male's sperm when he inserts his. And the female can keep that sperm alive for a while, and eventually she will lay eggs and fertilize them with the stored sperm. So that's another rather extreme case of male-male competition where the female body is the battleground. Incidentally, there was a paper that came out a few years ago that claimed this is the reason for the human penis having the shape that it does, that the human penis is good at extracting the sperm of rival males. I'm not sure whether I buy that or not, and I'm almost sorry I mentioned it, but there has been some research on there to apply this model to other organisms than just dragonflies. It gets even worse. The bean weevil is this tiny little insect that is a pest on Asian beans, mung beans, and another type called adzuki beans, which you may not be familiar with, but you can get them in the Asian grocery store in this town. And this is his reproductive organ. This is from a male bean weevil. And you'll notice that it's tipped with a whole bunch of spines, and it causes very severe wounds inside the female's genital tract. The scientists that were studying this, that actually wait to catch bean weevils mating, and then they drop the paired weevils right into liquid nitrogen so that they could stop mating very precisely, just literally freeze frame it right there. And then they would dissect the happy couple to see what was going on. And they found that the male's intromittent organ stabs the female internally and causes rather bad wounds. That's another case of male-male competition, because a female that's just been stabbed up the passage is not interested in mating again. So that's another case of male-male competition where the female body is the battlefield. And then finally, fruit fly semen turns out to be some really fancy stuff. Chemicals that are found in fruit fly semen decrease the female's, quote, libido. They lower the odds that she will be interested in mating with another male. They also increase the female's egg production, and they also are toxic to the sperm cells of other males. The problem with this is they're also toxic to the female. So a female that never mates will live considerably longer than a female that does mate. And it's because females that mate are quite literally poisoned by male semen. which makes me want to start singing that Britney song. I'm in love, but you're toxic. You're toxic. You know, the one where she does the like the pole dance past the laser beams and all that. You're toxic. Well, male fruit flies are toxic. This is definitely a toxic relationship. And I'll mention that Bateman, remember the guy that we started all of this with, came up with Bateman's rule, claiming that, males were adapted to reproduce a lot, and males are adapted to be competitive and females are adapted to be choosy. He'd been studying fruit fly behavior, and it's now looking like the reason why female fruit flies are choosy about who they'll mate with is because male semen has this behavioral effect on them and makes them less likely to mate with other males. So, what the females are doing is not necessarily adaptive to them. It's a product of the way that males are trying to manipulate their behavior. So, there's a lot to unpack right there. So, this is yet another case of male male competition inside the female body. Yeah. Yet another form of male male competition is infanticide. This actually happens more often than we might be comfortable with. There's an Indian langur monkey. They live in groups of one male and several females. The male impregnates the females and they take care of their babies. A strange male may try to take over the group, and if he succeeds, he will kill all of the infants in the group, or at least he will try to. And the reason is that that causes the females to come into estrus sooner. They will ovulate sooner if their babies are removed. They'll stop lactating and their ovaries will get ready to release more eggs. So it's grim, but a male Indian langur monkey that takes over a troop will try to kill all of the infants. Naturally, this is bad from the female point of view. So the females will try to defend their infants. And the result can be a bit touch and go. The same is true for lions, where you have groups of a dominant male and a group of females that do most of the work. The females, of course, nurse and raise their cubs. Once a female gives birth, she's not going to be in estrus for another 18 months. And every so often you'll get a stray male that will try to take over a pride, especially if the existing male is old. And if a strange male takes over a pride, he will promptly attempt to kill the cubs. This makes the females receptive sooner. The females do fight to defend their cubs. The females form these communal cub rearing groups called creches, and they can defend against a male better than a lone female could. But if the male succeeds, the females will come into estrus and produce his offspring. Whereas if he just sits around and waits, it could be as much as 18 months before they're ready to start having his babies. So it is to a new male's reproductive advantage if he kills the existing infants in the pride. Hopefully they get rescued by wisecracking meerkat and warthog. Yeah, there is actually a biological basis behind the story of the Lion King. It isn't just Hamlet translated to the African savannas. And there's no mandrill baboons acting as priests that hold up the baby. But anyway, right. Okay, but females aren't just passive battlegrounds for male competition. And you can see that most strongly in the case of bird species that are called altricial. Birds are by and large either precocial or altricial. Precocial birds, the babies are up and walking very soon after hatching. Ducks would be a great example. It'll take them a while to learn how to fly, but they can walk, they can feed, they can swim very soon after coming out of the egg. These American robins are altricial because the babies are hatched completely helpless and requires a great deal of investment of resources from both parents. This is a case where it's hard to apply the rules because both parents have to spend a huge amount of time seeking out food and feeding their babies. Many altricial birds form pair bonds. There'll be one male and one female that will incubate the eggs and raise the offspring together. It used to be thought that these birds were sexually monogamous, that a paired male and female um, were raising the offspring that they had produced by mating with each other. And then comes the development of genetic testing methods, and it turns out that both female and male birds actively seek out EPCs, that's extra pair copulations. So a female bird will fly around looking for other males to mate with, and a male bird will try to mate with other females if he gets the chance. This is social monogamy, but it sure as heck is not sexual monogamy. Males, it's adaptive for them to seek out extra pair copulations because males that do will have more babies than males that don't. But is it adaptive for females to seek out extra pair copulations? Bateman would have said no, again, because, since bird eggs are so much bigger than bird sperm, um, females invest more in reproduction, and it's not to their advantage to seek out multiple males because it only takes one male to fertilize all the eggs that the female can produce. So you wouldn't think mating with multiple males would be advantageous for the females. One proposal was that females sought out extra pair copulations as insurance against genetic incompatibility, which is kind of what we saw in those pseudoscorpions earlier. But a study in 2007 showed that at least in that species, this isn't likely. There was no link between EPCs and the incidence of infertile eggs. So at least in reed buntings, that hypothesis doesn't seem to work. But it's also hypothesized that females seek out EPCs to males of high genetic quality. Nicole Gerlach looked at this in dark-eyed juncos, and what you're looking at here is the offspring of EPCs are shown as black bars, and the offspring of WPCs within pair copulations are shown as white bars, and the offspring produced by EPCs have higher lifetime fitness, a higher total number of F2 offspring that they produce. So a female that seeks out EPCs will have more grandkids than a female that does not seek out EPCs. So the idea is that females seek out extra pair copulations. They're seeking it out with males of high genetic quality, maybe males with better genes than the male that they've paired up with has. Reed buntings, it's been showed that extra pair young whose parents are not paired up, young that are raised by another male, are more heterozygous than young that are produced within a pair. And the females may be picking not so much genetically superior males, or not always genetically superior males, but genetically dissimilar males. Females might be deliberately trying to mate with males that are genetically unlike them as a possibly an anti-inbreeding measure. So all of this ultimately makes sense. The last thing I'll say before we go is when you read things like this, try as hard as you can not to apply this to humanity, because humans have culture and humans are weird. And it's easy for us, especially maybe with mammals and birds, maybe more so than spoonworms, to anthropomorphize the animals that we're studying and imagine, well, first of all, imagine animals thinking these sorts of things through, which, as far as I know, they don't really do. A female reed bunting is not thinking, hey, I'm paired up with this guy, but I'll bet I can have more awesome offspring if I just fly off for some quick nookie with that hunk next door. Birds are not thinking that. I once asked a test question about this, and one of the students, I'm guessing, had just gone through a bad breakup because he kept writing about female birds and using the words, he was calling them bitches and hoes. And clearly the guy had some issues. But I'll say it here, birds are not bitches and hoes or man hoes. Birds do what birds do because it's adaptive, because it makes sense. It doesn't have to make sense from our point of view. We're not birds. We're subject to very different selective pressures. There is a field called evolutionary psychology, and I'll be talking about it later. And in Evo Psych, you do try to analyze human behavior, including sexual reproduction, in the light of biological evolution. It's extremely controversial. It is hard to get right because human behavior is so complicated and so filled with things that we learn that may not be that relevant to biological evolution on the genetic level. Humans do all sorts of crazy things that don't outwardly look like they enable us to pass on our genes. In fact, sometimes they stop us from doing that. So try to avoid, when we talk about this, thinking about organisms as if they're thinking. They may not be, not in the way that humans would. They're not necessarily making rational decisions. They may not be deciding anything at all. And try to avoid analyzing it in human terms. We're one species and we do things in a certain way. Other species are different. They're exposed to different types of selective pressure, and what they do works for them. And our value judgments as to whether this is a good idea don't really matter. And on that note, I'm going to stop the recording.